Good evening, everybody. Welcome to you all, and thanks for joining the penultimate Sunset series of 2021. It's lovely to see the number of people that we've got today. At the moment, we're already on 116 people. The talk is actually fully booked, so with 150, so really, really brilliant. And thank you ever so much for joining us. I'm Sarah from Morecambe Partnership, and I'm thrilled to be chairing the event this evening. Tom, our chair, is unfortunately otherwise engaged, so the mantle has been passed to me for this evening. I'm now going to introduce Bill. So we're welcoming this evening Bill Froggatt from the Canal and River Trust. He's their heritage advisor for the Northwest, and I'm told on very good authority that there's nothing he doesn't know about the Lancaster Canal and canals more broadly across the Northwest. So it's over to you, Bill.
Thank you, Sarah, for inviting me, and thank you everyone for joining us, particularly those who've had to travel far from Indiana and Australia. It's great to see you. I mean, I'd rather be in a room with you. I'm sure we'd all like to get out of our houses, but the benefit doing it this way is obviously we can get people from all around the world, but also I can surround myself with bits of paper with facts and figures on, so I don't have to remember it all stood up in front of you. But yeah, so I work for the Canal and River Trust, which is a charity which looks after 2,000 miles of canals and navigations across England and Wales. We are obviously responsible for keeping the water in the canals and keeping them flowing for boaters. But there's a lot more to what we do than that. A lot of the structures, there's something like 15,000 structures on the canal, locks and bridges and aqueducts, etc., which are, up to 250 years old, built by some renowned engineers, one of whom I'll mention a bit later, and which are, well, showing their age, basically. They were built for transport 250 years ago, which was, the bridges were built for horses and carts, not heavy goods vehicles. Well, the climate has changed, and the heavy rainfall we get puts problems on us as well. So 15,000 structures across England and Wales, 344 aqueducts, over 3,000 bridges, 1,500 locks, 54 tunnels. On the Lancaster Canal, that's something like 24 aqueducts, 230 bridges, 22 locks, 2 tunnels, and 141 culverts. Across the country, something like 3,000 of our structures are listed, so they have legal protection, and we have 50 scheduled monuments, and 2 of those scheduled monuments are on the Lancaster Canal, Sedgwick Aqueduct, and the Hincaster Horse Path. But so, as I said, it's not just about looking after the canal. We're very keen to engage with the communities that live next to the canal in certain parts of the country, the built-up areas, Birmingham, Venice of the North, as it's known. There is very little opportunity for people to get out and get some exercise, and the canals provide a really good opportunity to do that. But also not just to walk up and down and fish and cycle, but also to volunteer for us and help us maintain the canals, doing litter picking and vegetation removal, etc. And also looking after the ecology. Whilst they're man-made structures, they've been there for a long time and are natural habitats in their own right. And just an illustration, in the centre of Burnley, an urban area, I've seen kingfishers on numerous occasions, coming right into the centre of town. But this talk really is really about the roots of the canal, some of the people that were involved in building it, and just a bit of a look about some of the structures that are on the canal. But before, hang on. Oh, here we go. So my first slide, hopefully you can see that, canals in the Northwest. I think it's worth putting the Lancaster Canal into context with the other main canal in the Northwest, which is the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. And hopefully you can see my map there. The Leeds and Liverpool Canal, as it says on the tin, goes from Leeds to Liverpool, or Liverpool to Leeds, depending on whether you're from Yorkshire or Lancashire. As I'm from Yorkshire, I'll say it starts in Leeds. It goes as high as Gargrave, which is almost in the national park, the Yorkshire Dales National Park, and then heads down towards Burnley, goes through Blackburn, swoops down to Wigan, and then goes around the coast to Liverpool. And then we have the Lancaster Canal, which is what we're talking about today. Up on the left there, from Preston, it doesn't actually go as far as Kendal now. The top section has been filled in, but it did at one stage reach Kendal. And then there's two little branches off the Lancaster Canal there. The one in the middle, just south of Lancaster, is to Glasson Dock, which was a dock built by the Lancaster Port Authority to overcome the fact that the estuary that Lancaster on kept silting up, making it difficult for ships to get to Lancaster. So they built a dock, and eventually the canal built a branch to the dock. And then there's a little branch at the bottom you can see there in Preston. That's a Millennium Link built, well, about 20 years ago. And that links the canal to the Ribble Valley, the Ribble Estuary. So it is possible now to sail onto the Lancaster Canal, whereas for most of its life it wasn't possible to do that. So this is the landscape we're talking about. Leeds and Liverpool across the bottom, Lancaster up the side, north to south. Well, if you turn back the clock, the original intention when these canals were being built, or they started to be built, looks something different. You can see the Lancaster Canal goes down, well, a lot further south than originally shown. It goes down to this little grey blob down here. If you can see my cursor, just to the right of Wigan, that's a place called West Orton. And there was a lot of coal around West Orton. And it went up through Preston to Garstang, Lancaster, then up to Kendal. And if you're local, you'll know that Kendal is a limestone area, but also in the lakes there was slate. But the moving of coal and limestone was, if you like, one of the main reasons for building the canal, and that's why some people refer to it as the Black and White Canal. But it's fair to say also the Leeds and Liverpool Canal was built for the same reason, primarily to move coal and limestone, although in time they obviously carried many things over and above coal and limestone, but coal really was the king. The ability to move large amounts of coal, up to 50 tons in one boat, really halved the price of coal in various towns, and was one of the foundations, really, one of the enablers of the Industrial Revolution. Just the ability to move coal, the ability to move raw materials of all sorts, and then to move finished products, really fired up the Industrial Revolution. So you can see, if you just look at the map there, and you can just look at the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, the blue line, the solid blue lines are bits of canal which were actually built. So they exist today. The dotted blue line in the middle was the original intended route of the canal, and it was going to go down the Ribble Valley. And that was the route in 1770. They got the Act of Parliament to build, and that's what they started building in 1770. The Lancaster Canal, they started talking about building the Lancaster Canal around about the same time that they started talking about building the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. But whereas the committee for the Leeds and Liverpool Canal got their act together and got an Act of Parliament in 1770, the Lancaster committee really couldn't agree on a route for the canal, which is a bit odd, really, isn't it, when it just connects a succession of towns going down the coast. But in actual fact, they didn't get their Act of Parliament to start building the canal until 1792, so over 20 years later. And the reason why they eventually got their act together and and agreed a route and started building it was because in around about the 17, oh, hang on, let me just show my next screen. this shows progress of canal building by the 1780s. So you'll see there was a canal from Gargrave to Leeds in the east, and there was a canal from Wigan to Liverpool in the west, and there was no canal in the centre. Remember, that was the bit that was going to go down the Ribble Valley. But in 1790, when they were looking to complete the canal, they decided to change the route of the canal. And instead of going down the Ribble Valley, they decided to take it down via Burnley, Blackburn, Chorley to Wigan. Because there was coal in Burnley and there was coal in Blackburn. Well, that proved that was a bit of a problem for the Lancaster Canal, because if I just show you this next map, now it's worth having a look at this map in a bit of detail. But you'll see here we've got Wigan, we've got Liverpool, Leeds is over on the right hand side. The red line represents the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. But the top red line is the, as it says there, the parliamentary line of the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. That was the canal that they were building. And this lower red line is the deviation of the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. And that was the alternative route that they planned. The yellow line is the proposed, because they hadn't started building it yet, Lancaster Canal, down through Preston, down to West Horton, just here. Well, if you look just here, in the centre here, the deviation of the Leeds and Liverpool Canal would cause a problem. It would create a problem here, because it would be impossible politically to have two canals running next to each other just here. The landowners would never agree to something like that. And also there would be a shortage of water. There wouldn't be enough water to supply two canals. So the Leeds and Liverpool Canal actually started what you might call a dirty tricks campaign. And they started spinning, if we can use that modern term, phrase, against the Lancaster Canal, saying that it would never be built. So support our deviation. And this is what really made the Lancaster Canal get their act in gear, basically, and devise a route for their canal and get their Act of Parliament. And they got their Act of Parliament in 1792. Eventually came to a gentlemanly agreement, and this slide basically illustrates that agreement, in that they agreed that the Lancaster Canal would build this southern section, as it's known, down from around about Chorley down to Wigan, and the Leeds and Liverpool Canal would join on to that canal, and they would share this section in the middle. Although this section in the middle was built by the Lancaster Canal and was managed by the Lancaster Canal, and remained the Lancaster Canal until 1864, when it was leased to the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. So that is why the Leeds and Liverpool Canal now, if you remember that first slide that I show you of the canal, goes from Leeds all the way down here to Liverpool. So this section down here, and not a lot of people know this, was originally the Lancaster Canal. So they engaged, oh, hang on, before I tell you who they engaged again. This basically is the Act of Parliament, an act for making and maintaining a navigable canal from Kirby Kendal, which is Kendal's formal name, down to West Horton in the county of Lancashire. It mentions two branches, a navigable branch from Borwick to Warton Crag. Borwick, for local people, is near Chewetfield, around about, let me say, just here where my cursor is at the moment. And Warton Crag is over on the left here. It's a massive limestone outcrop. And the idea of that navigable branch was that they could quarry the limestone from Warton Crag and then take it down the canal. It also mentions another branch down here from to or near Duxbury, and that's down south of Chorley, down here, and that was to a coal mining area. And those two branches, if you like, neatly illustrate the main driver for the canal, as I mentioned earlier, to move limestone and coal. In the event, neither of those branches were actually built, but that was the original intention. And yes, now I can tell you who they engaged. John Rennie, one of this country's, early and finest civil engineers, was considered so important at the time that when he passed away, which was actually 200 years in October, he was buried in St Paul's Cathedral. And you know, not many engineers are given that privilege. But he was an engineer from Scotland. He set up business in 1791. He was based in London at that time, and consequently the Lancaster Canal, which he was engaged to survey the route of and then build, was one of his earliest, not the earliest, not the first, but one of his earliest commissions. He was involved in lots of other canals, the Rochdale Canal, and of relevance to this group, the Ulverston Canal. He perhaps is famous for building the London Bridge, which is the bridge that was sold to, I think it's now in Arizona. It was sold and moved brick by, or stone by stone. And as I say, he was buried in St Paul's Cathedral, considered to be a really important civil engineer. So if you read the history books, he is the person who you'll discover built the canal. Now, clearly he didn't build it on his own, and probably he never got his hands dirty. And actually, for most of the construction period, he wasn't even in Lancashire. He spent most of his time in London as a consultant. So there are a whole host of other people that time has forgotten who did build it. And I want to remember some of their names. Before I do that, those who know Kendal, this is John Rennie's survey for the canal in Kendal. The canal head is, well, you can see the castle there. So if you know Kendal, you know that the canal terminus was around about here. You can see John Rennie had it continuing onto the River Mint. I think that was probably for a water supply rather than as a navigable section. Yeah, so let's remember some of those people that time has forgotten, because John Rennie didn't build this on his own, and he wasn't the only engineer. He was what you would term the principal engineer, and there were resident engineers who were up here on site overseeing the construction of the canal. And there's a few of those mentioned there. Archibald Miller, another Scot, who was the resident engineer on the northern section. Henry Eastburn, who was on the southern section, that section that's now the Leeds-Liverpool Canal. William Cartwright was the assistant to Eastburn and Miller, and later had a key role in the Lune Aqueduct. Thomas Fletcher was the assistant to Eastburn, and later became the principal engineer, building the north of the canal from Chewerfield up to Hincaster, as it was. And then William Crossley Jr., he finished the canal from Hincaster into Kendal and built the Glasson Branch, and then he went off to be a railway engineer. So that's some of the the major engineers that assisted John Rennie building the canal. The contractors, all the work was contracted out, and the Lune Aqueduct, we'll see a picture of later, was built by, well, another Scottish person, Alexander Stevens, and his son, also called Alexander, conveniently. And then, so he built the Lune Aqueduct, a large section of the canal from Borwick down to Catterall, at a distance of 27 miles, was leased to a couple of chaps called John Pinkerton and John Murray. And Pinkerton is an interesting chap because he came from several generations of civil engineers, as we might call them, builders rather than engineers, but we refer to them as civil engineers now. He worked on canals all around the country. His father was a contractor, I'll say. His son was a contractor. But John Pinkerton was a man who didn't suffer fools gladly, or at least people he thought were fools. They weren't necessarily fools. And he frequently came into conflict with the people he was working for. And in fact, I think on one canal he worked on, he ended up in prison because of his activities. But on the Lancaster Canal, he was given 27 miles to complete, which was far too much, far too long a section to build, including all the structures. But But at the same time, he was also building the Ulverston Canal for John Rennie. So he really stretched himself really thinly. And he was frequently in conflict with the committee because progress was slow. He couldn't find enough people to build the structures that he was trying to build. The puddle that he was doing was too thin, and Archibald Miller in particular, who was also had an agricultural vocabulary, shall we say, frequently came to blows with John Pinkerton and John Murray. And actually, in the end, the contract was taken away from them, and it was leased out in smaller lots and completed by other people. So some more names of other contractors, Paul Vickers and John Lewis, who built some of the southern section, William Ross, who built some of the structures on the southern section, Robert Dickinson built the Wire Aqueduct, which is near Garstang, William Houston made swivel bridges, or turn bridges as they're sometimes called, Peter Grant built the Douglas Aqueduct, Tobias Savage did Puddling, and Puddling, if you don't know, was the way that a canal was made watertight. If a canal was being built through an area with sandy soil, which wouldn't retain water, they lined it with what they called puddle. And I've really only just discovered the ingredients for puddle. You might imagine it's clay, but of course clay does form a large part of it, but actually it was 2/3 gravel and 1/3 clay, and that was mixed up. Legend has it was mixed up by driving cows up and down the canal. I don't know if that was true, maybe it was in certain cases. That was mixed up, and a layer was put on the canal bottom to make it waterproof. Let's talk about Law and Richards, engine men at the Lune Aqueduct, who are a couple of colourful chaps. That's James Law. I don't know what Richard's first name was, but when they were building the Lune Aqueduct, they put caissons into the river Lune and then pumped the water out so that they could build the piers of the aqueduct. And Law and Richards used a steam engine, which was sourced from Bolton and Watt, famous steam engineers. And they basically, their role was to keep that engine working and to pump the water out of the caissons. Well, if you look at some of the letters written about the canal construction, you'll discover that Richards was rather fond of the bottle, i.e. he liked to drink. I've read elsewhere that James Law once refused to get out of bed one day and sent his mum in and said, and with the message, "If you don't pay me more, I'm not coming back." Well, there's a letter in the documents which basically says it's from a chap called Samuel Gregson, who you'll see is named at the bottom, to John Rennie, and Samuel Gregson says to John Rennie, Law and Richards have basically got the sack because they were burning too much coal. That was the excuse given. They're burning 3,600 weight of coal a day, which was costing too much. But I think reading between the lines, I suspect that they were causing a bit of trouble, and the canal company just wanted rid of them. But the coming of the canal to your town was cause for enormous celebration because it reduced the cost of coal significantly. And whenever the canal was opened in your town, like I say, there was a big party, perhaps not fireworks, but they had 21 gun salutes and the works. But whilst that canal was being made, it meant a huge influx of navvies, as we call them, navigation workers, and they were very unpopular with the local population. And I'll give you just read something from the Westmoreland Gazette from 1817. And this was at a time when they were letting the final contracts for completing the canal from Hincaster up to Kendal, which is just a few miles. And they went to a pub in Kendal to let the contract. And if I just might read from the newspaper. And before I do this, can I please apologise in advance if we have any friends from Ireland here? But the newspaper reads, a number of labourers attended on Monday at the letting of the canal, amongst whom were several disorderly Irishmen who remained in town all night and committed several outrages. What they basically did was take food and drink from the pubs and from the stalls in the street, and they refused to pay for it. And the newspaper article goes on. Their conduct at the Wheat Sheaf in Kirkland was outrageous in the extreme, for besides injuring the doors and windows, they forced the landlord, who was sick, from his bed and dragged him about the floors by his heels, besides maltreating his wife in a most inhumane manner. So whilst the building of a canal was very welcome, the locals were not very happy whilst it was being built. And finally, we get to Samuel Gregson. I should say he was probably the most important individual when it came to building the canal, perhaps besides John Rennie, who designed it. But Samuel Gregson was the secretary of the Lancaster Canal Company Committee. And he essentially, I think today we would probably refer to him as the project director. He organised everything. He basically organised the construction of the canal, made sure that the materials were available, made sure that there were engineers where they needed to be, oversaw purchase of the land. Without Samuel Gregson, the canal would not have been built. He comes across in his letters as being quite a nice person, firm but fair, you might call him, but a reasonable individual. I discovered just last week, actually, that I don't know his full involvement, but Samuel Gregson appears in a database on the University College London, I think it is, of people who benefited from the slave trade. And I think he had shares in over 100 slaves in St. Vincent, which perhaps puts a different spin on Samuel Gregson. But it's impossible to, the canals did benefit from slavery, as the economy did in general. The Lancaster Canal, there was a chap called Moses Benson, who was a slave trader in Liverpool, and he had more than 200 shares in the Lancaster Canal. There's another guy who was the MP at Lancaster. He had 10 shares in the canal. He was also an MP and a slave trader. So there's clearly, a dark side to the canal and to all of our canals, I think. So there's some of the people who we have to thank for the canal. And I've been talking to you about the Lune Aqueduct, and if you're local, I'm sure you'll have seen the Lune Aqueduct before and visited it. For those from further afield, this is possibly one of the finest structures on all of England's canals. It takes the canal over the River Lune, after which Lancaster is named, and one of John Rennie's perhaps finest structures that he ever built, I think. It's 600 feet long, 60 feet high. It has 5 semicircular arches with a diameter of 70 feet, carries a canal over the river, as I've said. It was built between 1794 and 1797 by Alexander Stevens, who I've mentioned earlier. He was given the contract to build it, but the canal committee weren't happy with what he was doing on the piers, those sections in the river, so took that work away from him and gave it to William Cartwright, one of the engineers who I mentioned. It took 3 years to build, and was vastly over budget, in the great tradition of building large structures. It was estimated that it would cost 18,000, equivalent perhaps today of 1.5 million, and in the end it cost 48,000, 3.7 million. So it went, doubly over budget. And it has been said that the cost of this structure actually prevented the canal actually being completed. So it is, you can just see in that picture, you can just see in the centre there, there's a little entablature, and there's one on the other side as well. And one says, one's engraved, Old needs are served, far distant sights combined, rivers are joined by art to bring new wealth. It's written in Latin, so that's a bit of a translation. And the other side says, to public prosperity. Now, I mentioned it's built by Alexander Stevens, but Alexander Stevens Sr. didn't live to see it completed, unfortunately. And there is a letter from Samuel Gregson to John Rennie, if I just might quote it. He refers to him as the old gentleman to differentiate him from the young Alexander Stevens, who was referred to as the young gentleman. But he says, the old gentleman had the misfortune to be run down by a cow in the street, which had broke loose from the butcher's. He was considerably bruised, but is getting better very fast. Well, there's another letter, that was in November 1795. There's another letter in January 1796, just 2 months later, in which Samuel Gregson says, poor Stevens is exceeding ill and his recovery very doubtful. And in fact, he died 2 days later. And I wonder if perhaps those two things were connected, and perhaps he was more injured, maybe internally injured by being run down by a cow, and never really recovered from his injuries. So he died 1796, January 1796. His son, Alexander Stevens, completed the works, which was November 1797. So one of the finest aqueducts on the canal, 400 yards away, there is one which is perhaps not quite so attractive, but I wanted to talk about this one because I really want to talk about the aqueduct that was there before this one was built. So if you know Lancaster, this is Caton Road heading north towards the M6, and you can just see under the aqueduct the McDonald's restaurant. Well, the M6 was originally the Lancaster bypass, and it was being built in the 1960s, and this was obviously the main route up to the bypass, and the local council felt that the original bulk aqueduct, as it's called, would not be suitable. It was too narrow for the traffic. And actually, if you look at that picture there, which I incidentally have taken from Google Earth, you can see there's a lot of traffic on the road, and it is a busy road, so probably they were right. But it was a great shame to lose the original Rennie aqueduct, which once stood here. This is one of the council's drawings from when they replaced the original aqueduct. If you just look on the left there, sorry, I've highlighted the original aqueduct in red. So this is, we're looking down on top on the canal, so you can see the canal is this wide, and we've got the structure of the canal around here, and then if I highlight the modern one, you can see that it's a lot narrower but a lot longer. Also, when they built this canal, because they couldn't cut the canal south of this aqueduct off from the canal north of this aqueduct, because the canal on the south would have dried up, because the water for the canal south of there comes from the canal north of there. So they built this elaborate structure, a gantry if you like, which allowed boats to be hoisted on and tracked across, but also underneath there is a water pipe, so water could continue to go along the canal. There's a picture of it here, in fact, so you can see the original aqueduct in the background, and then there's a gantry in front of it with a boat being taken along that gantry to get onto the south section. Here is the original aqueduct. It's a fairly, it's not quite as attractive as the Lune Aqueduct, but I think you'll agree it's more attractive than the new one, but also too narrow for all of the traffic that they expected to be using this road. Here is John Rennie's original drawing for this aqueduct, elevation of the Turnpike Road Bridge and bank near Bulk on the Lancaster Canal. Note in particular the original level of the road, right just underneath the arch there. If I just go back, you see, so the original level of the road was up here, so they had to lower the road to build this. You'll see over on the right the specification is signed by John Rennie and John Pinkerton, who I mentioned earlier, and down here you'll see John Rennie, it says Invent and Delin, London And there's a date there, 1795, December 1795. Basically, that means it's Latin for John Rennie designed and drew this specification. And then John Rennie signed it, and John Pinkerton signed it because he agreed to build it. There is a letter, another letter from Samuel Gregson to John Rennie, and in it he says, "The flat cap on the top of the pilaster at the bulk aqueduct will not have a good appearance. Could you not design something that will look more like a finished piece? The work looks well, and a little finish there would add to its beauty." And John Rennie responded with this diagram, drawing. You'll see he's come up with 5 alternatives to decorate the pilasters. That's these sections here on top of the aqueduct parapet. 5 suggestions from an obelisk that looks like a boat with a bow wave, an obelisk in the middle, some urns, possibly an acorn or pineapple, I'm not sure which, a ball, or nothing. And as you've perhaps remember from the photograph, the committee decided or nothing, and I assume because it was cheaper than doing the other fancy bits, for want of a better word. So yes, there you go, the pilaster with nothing on it. So they chose to go the cheap route. And here is quite a devastating photograph of that poor aqueduct being demolished in the early 1960s. Clearly at a time before we had any health and safety legislation, because it doesn't seem sensible to me to stand on an arch that you're demolishing, particularly if you're not actually involved in demolishing the arch. A lot of people stood around with their hands in their pockets, chap with a jackhammer, chiseling bits of stone off into the bucket. The chap beneath the bucket doesn't even appear to have a helmet. It's got no protection whatsoever if any of that stone bounces further down. You know, a kid stood in the front. Obviously that's not the sort of thing that would happen today. So a really great photograph, but you know, quite a heartbreaking photograph at the same time. So this is a drawing of an aqueduct that was not built, again designed by John Rennie. And if you remember at the start, I mentioned the southern section of the canal, south of Preston. Well, this canal, this aqueduct would have taken the canal over the Ribble River south of Preston. Very similar, I think, to the Lune Aqueduct, but with ellipsoid, if I might use that word, arches rather than semicircular arches. It was never built, and some people say it's because the Lune Aqueduct cost so much, but it was never built. And in its place was built a lot less auspicious, rickety thing, a timber aqueduct. If you know Preston, that incline on the right hand side is going up into Avenham Park. And basically, rather than completing the canal to join the southern section and the northern section, they built what they called a temporary tram line. So items, coal would come up from West Orton up to a place called Walton Summit on the canal. At that point, the canal finished and the coal was taken out of the boats, put onto carriages, wheeled down the hill to this viaduct, as it is, and then it was wheeled up through Preston to the canal terminus in Preston. Now, the construction of that tram line did improve considerably the profits of the canal company, but it was never ideal. It was never going to be ideal to have to unload every boat and then reload it again. It added a lot of time and expense. But this temporary solution lasted for over 60 years, and the canal was never completed in that middle section. And this is partially why. So this is John Rennie's survey from 1792. It shows on the left-hand side Preston, with the canal represented by the red line, coming north into Preston and then south out of Preston, across the Ribble River, where the aqueduct was going to be built, and then heading off south up to Walton Summit. Now, if you look carefully on the canal here, there's a series of chevrons which represent locks. And there are in fact 27 on there. So not only would they have had to have built that large aqueduct, they would have had to have built 27 locks, which in itself would have been an expensive business. And consequently, they didn't do it. It was never completed. The consequence, so on John Rennie's original survey, he proposed 36 locks, and in the event, not a single one of them was built. The Lancaster Canal is famous, well, amongst people like me, for having very few locks. It has, in the end, there was 22 built, none of which John Rennie had identified on his survey, but there's 3 sections, some at Chewitfield, some on the Glasson Branch, and some down on Johnson Tillock, which is now part of the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, but which was built by the Lancaster Canal. I've just included these drawings of a gate, of lock gates, just for something for you to look at whilst I was saying that bit. But the advantage of a canal which doesn't have many locks is that it's ideal for passenger transport, because the boat can travel quite fast and not have to constantly stop to get through locks. And this is a drawing of what they refer to as the packet boat. Packet boat because it also served for delivering parcels, but this was essentially a passenger transport boat. And I've just superimposed on there, on the plan at the bottom, the boat basically had 3 cabins. The forecabin on the right was the first class compartment, at the back the second class compartment, and in the middle the steward's cabin, where he would provide food and refreshments. There are, interestingly, several contemporary descriptions about a journey on the packet boat. Really interesting, really adds a lot of colour to this. One of them, written by an anonymous fellow, says it's the best journey he's ever had, from Preston to Kendal. He set off at 1:30, arrived in Kendal at 9 o'clock. So that's what's about 7.5 hours, I think. Bit of quick maths. It travelled at 9 miles per hour, was pulled by 2 horses. The second horse was ridden by a boy because the bridges were quite low, and if you were too big when you were riding a horse, the bridge would knock you off. And the boy would ride the second horse, and drive the first horse. And just excuse me while I find a document. The helmsman on the boat had a horn and a whistle, and if the horses were driving too fast, he'd blow his horn, and the boy would slow the horses. And if he was driving too slowly, he would blow his whistle, and the boy would speed up. And it was possible. Obviously, you could get a ticket from, let's say, from Kendal to Lancaster, and it would cost you 3 shillings if you went first class, which is about £8, which I think compares quite nicely with the train ticket from Kendal to Lancaster, which is about £10 today. So quite comparative. But it was also possible to get food on the boat. If I just find this other article, they would these people. There's an article called "Jots and Tittles" by a wandering trio who describe a journey on the packet boat in 1846, and they talk about eating veal pies and plum cakes served on broad captain's biscuits. The last serve for plates till the pies are ended. So that's the sort of thing they were eating on there. I think there are some other rules. Yes, I've got some in the background. You can see a letter to a chap, John Moss, who was one of the owners of the, or one of the he ran one of the packet boats on behalf of the canal company. And down there you can see some rules which the canal company imposed. They are you weren't allowed to you weren't allowed to spell, it's not on there, but they weren't allowed to sell spirituous liquids, so whiskey, vodka, gin, that sort of thing. But they were not prohibited from selling malt liquor, so beer. They could sell beer. They had to provide tea, coffee and other refreshments. Obviously veal pie and plum cakes is what they supplied, and they had to keep the windows in good repair. That seems a bit random. And then there's something about the charges that were charged. But the wandering trio describe how you would get off on and off the boat. I mean, obviously you could get on at Kendal, or you could get on at Lancaster or Preston, but you could also, if you wanted to, request to stop along the canal and get off anywhere, basically. And the wandering trio say, and I'm quoting here, at occasional bridges, the passage boat is drawn towards the side and some passengers quickly leap to the shore and stumble against the expectant attendants. His luggage is clumsily ejected after its owner. The postilion cracks his whip, the rope tightens and leaps from the water with a shower of drops, and we're off again. And that I think the image of someone diving headlong off the boat, flying into the people waiting for him, and his luggage being thrown after him, really underlines the importance of speed here and the need to keep the boat going as fast as they could and keeping the journey as quick as possible, because they were, by the 1840s, 1846 when that was written, they were competing with the railway line by that point. So speed was of the essence. Oh, there we go. You're not to sell wine or spirituous liquor on board the boat. Let's talk about the tunnel. There were two tunnels on the canal. This one is at Lancaster. The other one was at Whittle Woods, which is down on the southern section. Both of these tunnels are on abandoned sections. This was designed by, this is near Kendal. You can see it from the A590 when you're driving from the M6 to Kendal, and you'll see that the West Coast Main Line just goes over the end. So when you're driving along the dual carriageway, if you see the railway bridge, quickly look to the left and you'll see this tunnel. This was designed by Thomas Fletcher. It looks like it's limestone. It is limestone, but this was probably the first structure in this part of the country, large structure, to be built of bricks. And although you can't see it from this picture, and actually you have to look very carefully if you visit it, the tunnel is actually built from bricks. And this was quite controversial because the local committee didn't trust bricks. This was a stone part of the country and they didn't think bricks would be up to the job. So they actually spent a good year deciding how they were going to build it. And the reason why they wanted, or the engineer wanted to use bricks, was because this limestone is really, really hard and not really suitable for building stuff like this. The cost of building it from limestone was just going to be phenomenal, really. So they investigated using bricks for a year. They wrote to a chap called Benjamin Bevan, who was a canal engineer down in the south of the country, who was, very familiar with bricks. And essentially, the letter says, this says we don't have suitable stone, and we're thinking about using bricks, seeking the advice of Benjamin Bevan from Leighton Buzzard, as it was. The other thing was that Thomas Fletcher, at the time, was living in Heversham, which is down on the bottom here. This is a location of the tunnel, Lancaster Tunnel, and he was living in Heversham, and he noted that over towards the river, where it's nice and flat here, a floodplain, he found a good source of clay, which could be used for building, creating and making the bricks. Incidentally, Woodhouse, just here, is where the limestone came from. And if you just look in this circle here, we've got some fairly square fields. And this one here, it looks a bit higgledy-piggledy at the right-hand end of this field. That is the remains of the clay pit that the bricks were made from. And in the event, the committee decided to use bricks essentially because it was cheaper. And the tunnel was awarded the Transport Trust Red Wheel a couple of years ago. And this is the Transport Trust is a charity which celebrates the modern transport network, railways, canals, etc., etc., and they award their red wheel to structures which they consider to be important for the development of the transport networks. And if you know Kendal, you'll know that the canal doesn't exist anymore. This is an image that I found on the Britain from Above website, and you can see the terminus there. That's now all filled in. But if you don't know where it is, on the right hand side, if you've ever been to the household tip in Kendal, that's just on the bottom right hand corner here. And the packet house where you'd get off or get on the packet boat used to be just next to this warehouse just here. This was filled in the 1940s, I think. Let me just find my notes. Yes, the canal was closed in 1941, just north of the gasworks in Kendal, which was near the cemetery, Kendal Cemetery, and it was closed because it kept leaking. It being a limestone area, it kept open to the gasworks for the coal supply. But that's not there anymore, that section. And just briefly, I'm probably going over time. Let me check the clock. Yes, going over time. So I'm going to really skim over this. But it is said that the canal brought Georgian architecture into the area. Bearing in mind all the people that were working on it were from other areas. Rennie was Scottish. He lived in London. All of the engineers came from other parts of the country and were familiar with Georgian architecture. The house on the right is at Glasson. It's the lockkeeper's cottage. Still there, you can see it here. Has a very strong Georgian appearance. So there may be something in that theory, but I've never researched it. I'm just going to quickly flick through the bridges. You may be familiar with the bridges on the Lancaster Canal. They basically look like this. This is John Rennie's drawing. You can see he's signed it at the bottom. And again, it's signed by Peter Grant and Company. He was the contractor who built some of the bridges. I think he worked on the southern section. And that ended up looking something like this. So this is a typical Lancaster Canal bridge. This one is near Preston. They generally look like that. But if you're familiar with, let me just say, they generally look the same, these bridges. But if you are very observant, you occasionally see something on them quite interesting. Now, I don't know if you can see that in the middle of the picture, just here. There is a face engraved on the side of the bridge. Now, this particular bridge, Bridge 53 near Garstang, actually has 3 faces engraved on it. Some of them on the keystones above the canal. So it hasn't been done by some ne'er-do-well. It was done, I think, when the canal was built, when the bridge was built. And the only theory I have for it is that in myth and legend, it's often said that evil lives under bridges, Billy Goat's Gruff and all that sort of stuff. And these faces were there to scare off the evil from underneath the bridges. So if you're ever on the canal near Catterall, I think it is, Bridge 53, look out, see if you can see those faces on the bridges. So we've seen a standard bridge, but many of the bridges on the central section of the canal actually look like this. So they've had the stone parapet removed, replaced by these unsightly railings. And when I first started working in the job, I thought, well, what an act of vandalism. Why did they do that? And it took a few years to realise that it was done as part of the war effort in 1940. And if we look at this document here, this is actually an order from Western Command, which was given in July 1941. And you'll see that it says certain command lines along which defensive posts, roadblocks and anti-tank obstacles will be constructed. The object is to extend throughout the vulnerable parts of the command a number of lines in which an enemy advancing with or without tanks will find no gaps or weak places, against which he will be held firm until mobile troops can attack and destroy him. And it mentions up here the list of lines is in Appendix A. Here's an excerpt of Appendix A and number 15, Preston to Lancaster. Essential to prevent rupture of communication by main road from either east or west. So the canal basically was turned into a stop line, as it's called, and all of the features you can see on this picture were put in to fortify this and all of the bridges in the central section of the canal, including this wire rope, which has been hanging there since 1941. That wire rope would have been dragged over the exit from the bridge in the event of an invasion to stop anyone crossing. And you'll see the tank traps on the landward side, and also these clay pipes which have been sunk into a concrete sill on the exit to the bridge, in which sort of telegraph poles would have been sunk to prevent anyone crossing. So an interesting, I think, addition to the history of the canal. And I've gone over, I think, a little bit, so I apologise for that. But that is my final slide. And if anyone has questions, I'll be very happy to take them.
Thanks, Bill. That was brilliant. Really, really interesting, and just some incredible architecture there. That some of which still exists and some which doesn't, sadly.
Yes.
So yeah, no, amazing. And wouldn't it be lovely if our canals were much more navigable than they currently are? So, and I know that's one of the plans, hopefully, for the Lancaster Canal.
Yeah. It'd be great to see some, used commercially again, to get some lorries off the roads.
Absolutely, yeah. There's something to be said for that, without a doubt. Okay, so if we can have any questions for Bill in the chat, that would be incredible. Wendy said thank you, an interesting talk. That's really good. And Michelle was saying earlier that she drives under the bridge in Lancaster that was demolished, and then that awful 1960s, 70s structure was put up, which is just hideous. What a shame. Wouldn't it have been lovely if they could have kept the old one? But there was a rhyme or reason to it.
The questions there, just whilst people are typing theirs into the chat, would you mind? I just wondered, I wanted to ask, because obviously I live in Lancaster, so I see the Lune Aqueduct quite regularly, and I know it's been drained quite a few times in recent years, and there's been works, and I just wondered, when it's drained, how much of the kind of original lining and everything is still there, or has that been long replaced now, or did they still uncover the original so lining and so on when it's drained?
Yeah, on the aqueduct itself, the original lining is still there, and it's beautifully it's what we call an invert, which is short for an inverted arch, basically. So it's a beautiful, the channel of the aqueduct is beautifully dressed stone in an upside down arch, and all the original stuff is still there. The last time we drained the canal was just a couple of years ago, actually, was to line the canal between the bulk aqueduct and the Lune Aqueduct, a distance of about 400 meters, which has historically had an issue with leakage. In fact, it breached very shortly after it was built and had to be repaired. And we had to we drained it and lined it with something as prosaic as a pond liner, basically. You might think it wouldn't survive, but it does.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Michelle. So we've got a question from Michael. Was the Hincaster section originally planned elsewhere and diverted by Sedgwick?
So yes, is the short answer. When John Rennie originally did his route, it went through Sedgwick, so down from Kendal to Sedgwick, as it is now, down to Hincaster, and from Hincaster it went due south down to Borwick at the foot of Tuitfield. And John Rennie stopped, basically resigned from the canal in the late 1790s. That section was built later, 1813 to 1819, by Thomas Fletcher, and they did change the route. But they changed it away, rather than going south through Hincaster, they went east towards Stainton, and then down the east side of the M6. And it is said they moved it to benefit the gunpowder works, not at Sedgwick, because the canal was going to go through Sedgwick anyway. Possibly the ones at Gatebeck, is it called, near Endmore. Crooklands was a wharf for the gunpowder works there. So it is said that's why they changed the route, but I've never actually seen that written in primary evidence, but it could have been why they did it.
Great, thank you. We've got a question from Melvin. Please could you comment on the passage of the package boats through the tunnels? They leg the boat, in which case this would slow down the speed of progress.
Yes, it would have done. Yeah, at Lancaster Tunnel, there is, I mentioned there's 2 scheduled monuments, and one of them is the horse path at Lancaster Tunnel. The tunnel doesn't have a tow path, so the horses were disconnected and sent over the hill, and they met the boat at the other end. If you ever at Lancaster, you'll see there's some metal stanchions sticking out the side of the tunnel, and there was a rope or a chain hung from those stanchions all the way along the canal, all the way along the tunnel, and that was used to pull the boat through. I think actually it's too big to leg through that tunnel, so I think probably it was a case of towing themselves through it. And yes, it would have slowed it down definitely, but as would the locks at Chewitfield. But they are really only the 2 points on the canal which would have slowed the progress of the boat, the packet boat.
Great, thanks, Bill. Got lots of people saying how they've walked the canal either in lockdown. Somebody walked part of it today. So lots of people really enjoying the canal, which is lovely, and also enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
That's all brilliant. Michael has another question. There are several crossover bridges for horses. Can you comment?
Yes. So where the towpath moves from one side of the canal to the other, and there is this happens in Lancaster, just before the Waterwitch pub, and further up the canal in Lancaster. The towpath, as the canal approaches Lancaster from the south, the towpath is on the left-hand side, the west side. But then if you get into Lancaster, opposite the Waterwitch pub, there is a series of basins. Obviously, it wouldn't have been possible for the horse to walk across the opening of those basins, so they moved the towpath to the other side of the canal to pass the Waterwitch pub as it is now, but which was probably stables at the time. And they devised what we call a change line bridge, which enabled the horse to cross the canal without actually detaching from the rope. So essentially, as long as the horse goes onto the bridge and off the bridge on the same side, the rope won't get tangled in the bridge, and that's known as a change line bridge.
Fascinating. Question from James: how did the packet boats negotiate other, perhaps slower traffic on the canal?
The packet boat always had the precedence. So if you were a boater and you saw the packet boat coming at a vast rate of knots, you had to move over to the side. And I've just discovered that how they did it, basically, because obviously there's some ropes there which potentially get tangled up again. But if you are if you're a coal carrying boat and you're coming towards the packet boat, you have to give way. And basically what happens is you move your boat over to the outside of the canal. The horse that's towing your boat will move to the outside of the towpath, and that will allow the packet boat and the horses to go through in between without tangling the ropes. So they'll just move to the side, the packet boat would come steaming through, and then they continue afterwards.
Great, thank you. There's a couple of questions here about the part of the canal at Stainton. So what progress is there on the restoration at Stainton? And part of the canal at Stainton has recently been rewatered. Will this be extended?
Yeah, okay. So at Stainton, we've done a lot of work at Stainton recently, partially because of the damage caused by Storm Desmond. December 2015 it caused a lot of damage in Cumbria and the area. And it damaged Stainton Aqueduct, which we subsequently had to repair. But at Stainton Crossing Bridge, which is at Stainton, that's where the Canal and River Trust land ownership finishes. And the Lancaster Canal Trust, which has been around for about 50 years, actually. It was formed when the M6 was built as to try and lobby the Ministry of Transport not to cut the canal. But so they formed 50 years ago. They have been restoring the first furlong which is between Stainton Crossing Bridge and the next bridge, whose name I can't remember, Sellet Hall Bridge, I think it is. They've been lining that with pond liner and concrete blocks, and it will eventually be connected to the canal. We'll remove the bund there and the water will flow into it. We just have to make sure, the Canal River Trust has to make sure that it is watertight, because if we let our water into that section and it leaks away, that'll be a problem for us. So it will eventually be extended, and I think probably it's a very expensive business, and I think the Lancaster Canal Trust will want to extend on from what they've done. Then they will get to the A590, which is a major barrier to completion, restoration of the canal. The canal will have to cross the A590 twice in order to get to Kendal. So there's some major hurdles there.
Great, thank you. Just a couple more. So is Killington Reservoir still used to supply the canal with water?
Yes, it is. Yeah. So Killington Reservoir, a long way north of the canal. If you've ever stopped off at Killington Services on the M6 coming south, you'll see a reservoir, and that was built by the Lancaster Canal Company to provide water for the canal, and that is partially why our canal extends as far north as Stainton. It's not navigable that high, but the water comes into the canal from Killington at a place called Peasy Beck, actually, which is near Crooklands. And that the north section of the canal north of Tuartfield is essentially now a large feeder which brings water from Killington down to the navigable canal south of Tuartfield.
Okay, I think we seem to be on the final stretch of questions now. So did any parts of the canal give rise to any overnight accommodation or refreshment halts, or was the route just too short?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I think probably there were some pubs next to the canal. Whether they were built after the canal, I don't know, but there were definitely some watering holes, shall we call them, along the canal. I think there's one in somewhere like Carnforth, in that sort of area. But yeah, I'm pretty sure there were inns and places to stay.
Yeah, Jill said the canal turn.
Yes.
Yeah. Brilliant. That's fantastic. Great questions, everyone. Really, really good, and lots of great, some real positive comments about your talk, Bill. So thank you. And just lovely to see that so many people are walking the canal as well. So yeah, thank you. Excellent. Okay, well, I think we're going to call it a night. It's 8:20. So it's been lovely, Bill. Thank you ever so much. We've really appreciated it. It's been hugely informative. And I, for one, am going to go and walk some bits of the canal to go and definitely look for faces on bridges.